Okay, this is going to be section 1.5 on parent functions and their transformations. Basically a review of Algebra 2, where we talked about all the different function families outside of the trig functions and the non-function functions like ellipses, hyperbolas, parabolas, and circles. The first function, the constant function, f of x equals c, is the simplest one, where we just have a horizontal line at value c on the y-axis. The second function, f of x equals x, we've referred to as a linear function, but they're going to identify this in its simplest form as an identity function. And that is simply where we have our x and y axis, and we have the y equals x line being graphed up through the origin. The next one is f of x equals x squared, and you recognize that, of course, as a quadratic function. Where we have our axes and our quadratic going through the origin, opening up in its most simple form. Okay? The fourth one is the cubic function. F of x equals x cubed. Remember, a cubic function, because it's third power, one end starts in one direction and the opposite end is in another. So in the cubic, it comes up through and then curves back around. Okay? So like a quadratic, only the first side's flipped in the opposite direction. The next function we're going to look at is f of x equals the square root of x, and that is a square root function. Square root function. Remember, we can't have a negative under the radical. You can't take the square root of a negative number without making imaginaries. So our square root function starts at the origin and heads up and out towards infinity. The next function is f of x equals 1 over x, and that, of course, is a reciprocal function. Where we have our axes, and 1 over x, when they are negative, gives us a graph that looks like this, and in the positive, looks like that. Next one is f of x equals the absolute value of x, which of course means we're talking about the absolute value function. In an absolute value function, we have our axes, and come down on one side, up on the other. And the last one we're going to talk about today, so 8 total, is our greatest integer function. This is the one most people dislike the most in Algebra 2. And the greatest integer function is also referred to as a step function. One, two, three. And the steps closed at 0, and it went all the way over to 1 where it was an open circle. And then it stepped up to a closed circle, over to 2 where it's an open, step up to 2, and all the values between 2 and 3. But once it hits 3, it's an open circle, and it'll step up to 3 and go from there. Okay? So within these, we can do some transformations. So let's look at just a few of them. Number 1, f of x is equal to the absolute value of x plus 4. So that means that every output is going to be 4 greater, which means a vertical up 4. So if we look at this, it's our normal graph, but it's going to start at 4 up and then head off at our normal 45-degree angles. If we put the plus inside of it, so if we have for number 2, f of x is equal to the absolute value of x plus 2, then that's going to change us in the left to right. So it's going to be horizontal, and the h is always the opposite, so even though it looks like a plus 2 here, it's going to be 2 to the left. So we have our, and in this case, we're simply shifting 2 to the left. For number 3, we have both f of x equals the absolute value of x minus 1 minus 2. Then the opposite of a negative 1 means right 1. And the negative 2 means down 2. So on our graph, we're going right 1, down 2 to get our vertex. And then our graph like so. Okay? The last thing we're going to talk about is reflecting over the x or the y-axis. So if we have f of x and we have a negative sign out front, that's going to cause a reflection on the square root function. It's going to basically change all the values from positive to negative. So whereas on our axis we had a curve that went up and out like that, we're going to have the opposite happening. It's going to be coming down and out like this as a reflection over the x-axis. If we put the negative on the inside though, that creates a reflection over the y-axis. So instead of it being over here, it's going to come as a reflection over the y. Okay? That's all of section 1.5, day 1 on parent functions and transformations. We'll come back with a little more on this tomorrow.